Hey guys, Tang with Fox Airsoft here, and today's video is going to be about troubleshooting your AEG. Now, a lot of new players getting their AEG out for the first time, sometimes they might incorrectly identify a problem or think something's a problem. So today's video is going to be about troubleshooting some actual problems as well as identifying some things that you might have missed as a new player that will help you run your AEG properly. All right, so let's get started. First area that you might have a problem with is the feeding or shooting of the gun. Feeding means having the BB go from the magazine into the gun and then having it exit as you shoot. So a couple of common problems would be BB's not coming out when you shoot. That one is, if you haven't cleaned the gun before, it might be indicative of a jam, poor quality BBs, or something of that nature that has to do with the hop up. If you have trouble with BBs leaving the magazine into the hop up chamber, you might have a problem with poor quality BBs getting stuck in the magazine not being lubricated, or magazine not functioning properly. Now, there's two kinds of magazines out there that you have to be aware of. One is a mid-cap magazine. You'll notice there's a smooth bottom, and a high-cap magazine, which you'll notice has a wheel. If you go back to our older videos, you'll notice we did a lot of videos highlighting the differences between a mid-cap and a high-cap. I recommend you watch that again, but in case you didn't know, mid-cap requires no winding, but it requires a tool to load. And a high-cap magazine requires you wind the magazine prior to inserting it to the gun in order for it to feed. Common problem with the magazine, if it's not working, it's just not working. But if there's something to look out for, it's commonly that a lot of people don't wind the magazine enough. So how much is enough? You can wind the magazine out of the gun or insert it in the gun. Sometimes if you jam the magazine super hard, the magazine becomes unwound. You have to do that again, so keep that in mind. How much you got to wind it is, you're going to wind it. Listen to the sound. You'll feel the spring tension. The BB should rise up. That's still not enough. You have to keep going until the spring tension gets tighter and it's turning, and it's becoming more difficult to turn this wheel. Once the sound of the wheel clicks in a different way, you'll hear it audibly, then you'll know it's ready to go. When it's ready to go, you can fire about a third of the magazine or up to half of the magazine before you have to do that again. So a lot of people, they fail to wind the magazine properly the first time, and they think the magazine's not working or having issues there. Another issue is if the magazine does not fit properly in your gun, be encountered out of the box. Typically, this might be a problem when you're mixing and matching brands of the magazine to the gun. The best advice I have to say is follow the recommendations of whoever you buy the gun from, that they have tested the magazines thoroughly and know they're compatible. That's your safest bet there. If it doesn't fit, you might have issues where it's not reaching properly or engaged in a way that allows the BBs to feed up into the hop-up chamber. So a common problem there. Okay, the next set of things you can look out for is in regards to the barrel and hop-up chamber. This will be problems in relation to having the BB fire out of the barrel or having jams or inconsistent accuracy and so on. First thing is a jammed barrel. Typically this will happen when your barrel's dirty or you're using low quality ammo, or the ammo has a defect in it that'll cause it to jam. That's indicative of when you're firing the airsoft gun and you hear a thud rather than your typical whack that makes the BB come out. The thud will be very hard to miss. If you have a jam, don't try to fire it out by pulling the trigger more. You're actually causing damage to the gearbox and could do worse. Your first thing to do is try to clear the jam by taking the magazine out using the unjamming rod, and then go from there. Another thing is BBs rolling out. So a common thing with BBs rolling out is it could be indicative of a bad bucking, but most likely it's from a lack of hop up. The hop up chamber, if you set it all the way to 0 or no hop, sometimes it needs that little resistance from the hop up to keep the gun feeding one at a time. If you don't have it set at all, typically maybe 1 or 2 or 3 BBs will get in there, and then you're gonna have them roll out. And that's typical of people that didn't adjust their hop up out of the box. Now, if you have a bad bucking, that's another thing that you could run into eventually. Buckings are wear items. They will eventually harden or dry or crack or things of that nature, and you will need to replace them or have them replaced. A bad bucking would be shown by you having a magazine that you know works well and is not feeding properly into the chamber, or you're having fluctuating FPS in the shots, or fluctuating accuracy. That's easily solved by replacing the bucking. It's a couple bucks. Recommend you learn how to do it yourself to save some money, but otherwise have someone qualified to do that for you. Another thing that we hear a lot about is magazine wobble and tight fitting of the magazine. Tight fitting of the magazine's good, wobble's okay. In fact, on the real one, it wobbles just a little bit, so don't stress out too much about it. As long as it feeds, that's the important thing. A lot of people also wonder when you pull out the magazine, some BBs fall out. Is that a problem? No, that's actually by design. These magazines typically don't feed the last couple rounds into the chamber here, so anytime you pull out the magazine and there's still BBs in the magazine, you'll probably have 3 to 4 coming out. Safety rule, be sure that there's not one in the chamber, so fire in a safe direction in the ground or somewhere that's not going to cause any harm, just to make sure it's clear before you do anything else. Okay, now let's talk about the electricals real quick. Electric powered guns, you have batteries here, so a couple of things you have to watch out for. One is when you use your airsoft gun, be sure your battery is fully charged. We get a lot of emails saying the gun's broke or something like that because people got impatient or think there's a charge in the battery out of the box. Batteries do not come fully charged. They're just enough to keep the battery maintained and from failing. It's a storage charge. If you use it right away, it's going to give lackluster performance, and that I could see how that leads to people thinking it's not working. But first, you should fully charge your battery before using it at all. Another thing about batteries is watch for any torn or loose or damaged wires or connectors. Any exposed wires could cause a short, and you know what happens when you have an electrical short there, so I won't go into that. When you're installing batteries into the gun, be sure you don't crunch or pinch the wires. That's what's going to lead to those damaged exposed wires that I mentioned. If you are trying to pull the trigger and your gun is not firing at all, no noise or anything like that, could be indicative of a few things, such as bad battery, no electrical connection, fuse is blown, or the motor is not connected. Typically, it's any one of those things, and that is not to be confused with when you pull the trigger and you hear a click and you can hear the gun trying to do something, but it's not quite fulfilling, it's not quite shooting the gun. That might be indicative of a poorly charged battery or some kind of electrical issue or a mechanical jam inside the gun that you probably need some professional help to resolve there. Now, going back into the motor not being connected, that could happen on occasion. We might see that from time to time. These connectors are held on by a slide connector or a spade connector, whatever you want to call it, and with the motor torquing as it's firing, sometimes these can work themselves loose. Some manufacturers, they don't secure it as good as others. It is what it is. All you got to do is inspect the motor grip. If you have an M4, check to see that the wires are connected and secure, and then you should be okay when you pull the trigger. If the wire pops off, you will probably not be able to get a cycle, or if it's barely on there, you might not get a proper cycle. You might hear like a partial cycle when you pull the trigger. Another thing about electrical systems in an airsoft gun, if you have a burnt out switch, this is more of a long-term problem. That means the electrical contacts are burnt out. That'll require replacement. You'll typically spot that when you pull the trigger and you get kind of partial cycles, or it's kind of struggling to do its job. That's potentially a worn out trigger contact. Lastly, for guns equipped with MOSFETs, if you have a gun equipped with MOSFETs, if the MOSFET is burned out, it's really going to fail only one way, and that's going to be stuck on an open circuit. What happens is your gun's going to fire on its own. Very dangerous condition. You have no control over it. So best thing to do, if you can, is if you encounter where your MOSFET is going haywire there, point it in a safe direction, let it do its thing, and try to disconnect the battery if possible. Otherwise, don't leave it unattended or anything like that. Be sure to watch it carefully because things can go crazy. Okay, moving on to the inside of the gun, which is the gearbox. You have a couple scenarios that you can have here, and these are more something that can be broken down long term or from possibly using a batch of bad BBs where it jams. I have here a gearbox here, pretty stripped down, but you'll get the idea. So a couple things you can encounter is a stripped piston. That means the teeth on the piston are stripped and the gears are trying to grab it and no longer can because there's no teeth on the piston. What that sounds like is the motor turning, and you'll hear the gears, but it'll sound like a kind of a gear turning sound and nothing else. That means your piston's not able to move. A stripped gear, on the other hand, sounds a lot more fierce. It's going to sound screechy, and what it's going to do is it could probably draw the piston back, but because there's a damaged tooth or missing teeth on the gear, you're going to hear like loud screechy noises. Your gun may still function, just not optimally, and it's only going to get worse over time. With either of these scenarios, it's going to require some gearbox work to replace, so seek out someone that's trained to help you, or else you're going to have to look in some YouTube videos and learn how to do this. It's a very extensive thing to do to take apart your airsoft gun. Lastly is a stuck piston. That's where your piston's drawn pretty far back, but is not able to overcome the last portion of the revolution of the gear to release the piston and fire the gun. What happens there is either maybe there's something stuck or caught in there, very rarely, but another thing is probably using a battery that wasn't charged enough or is on its last bit of juice, where it's just not enough to overcome this part of the cycle. That's going to require a lot more amperage, and as it gets stuck, you're trying to pull the trigger. It's only going to make it worse and try to draw more in the battery. If you get to that condition, don't keep trying to pull the trigger, obviously. Best to either seek someone out to unlock your gearbox, which will release this piston manually, or seek someone with a very strong battery, a high discharge one, like an 11.1 volt LiPo with a high discharge, and that should overcome that. If it's not, then probably the best way is to unlock the gearbox manually. Otherwise, some more serious look inside the gearbox is required. So the last component or section we should look at is the motor. I mentioned earlier about connectors really briefly, but we'll go into the motor. So the motor resides in, for like an M4, in the motor grip or the grip, pistol grip of the gun. The way you can check on this is you can remove the base plate and examine or take out the motor from there. Very easy to do. If you don't know what you're doing though, or not very careful with the wires, I would not recommend you do this, otherwise you can cause some damage. So things that can go wrong on a motor is, one thing is, obviously I said motor connectors, so be sure to check those if you're not getting any sort of response. Next thing is when you're shooting the gun, it sounds kind of high-pitched, whiny, screechy, that kind of thing. Could be indicative of your motor height adjustment working itself loose or not being at the proper height. You can adjust that with the screw on the base at the bottom. Also, you can check for wear on the pinion gear. As this wears out, or if this should wear out, it's going to result in poor contact with the gears, causing damage and making louder and louder screechy noises. A clean sounding gun should not be screechy. Very rarely on a high round count airsoft gun, the motor brushes could be kind of worn out, so you'll probably want to replace those brushes individually or upgrade to a motor of your choice just to keep it going. It'll kind of act like a gun where the switch assembly is burnt out, so you'll figure that out pretty fast just by looking and seeing if there's any copper debris or something like that in your motor grip. The last thing you could encounter is motor overspin. It's where when you pull the trigger on semi and you're, you have nicely freshly charged battery and it shoots twice rather than once. That could be a problem in fields that require to shoot only semi-auto, so that could get you in trouble there. What happens is a couple things. It could be you have a very strong battery, like an 11.1, especially on that fresh charge. It's giving its best output right at the beginning, so your gun's cycling double. Could be that your battery is stronger than your gun needs it to be, which is like, let's say you have a CQB gun and it's got a really light spring shooting about, M100 or less, and you have a 11.1 volt, you might get that overspin. Another thing that could be worn out is inside the gearbox, such as the cutoff lever. So that's a high mileage gun kind of problem that you can encounter. If your gun does overspin and it's brand new, probably just a byproduct of your gun being super efficient. So there's not much you can change there other than matching a battery properly to your gun there. All right, so that was a lot of information thrown at you all in a short period of time. Hopefully you can absorb it over the course of your airsofting careers. If you're an aspiring airsoft technician there, this should get you started in the right direction for the most common basic problems. If you can solve these, I would say you can move on to upgrading your guns or doing some crazy things with your own builds. Highly recommend that if you do these with your own guns, do it with a gun that's already broken, or maybe get a second gun. Don't do it with your only gun to start tinkering and taking things apart. Nothing good can come of it, and you only have to stress about having a non-functioning airsoft gun. All right, so if you like today's content or want to see more from us, we really appreciate if you share our content with your friends, especially other newbies out there. Or if you can, also be sure to like, comment, and most of all, subscribe so you can catch our latest YouTube videos and updates. We're also on Facebook, on Instagram, so be sure to check those out. And as always, we're always giving away an airsoft gun every quarter. Right now, we're giving away an ASG Mark 13 sniper rifle that's really, really sweet and very expensive. So if you want to get into airsoft sniping, I think that's one of the best guns out of the box. All right, that's our time for today. My name's Tang with Fox Airsoft. I'll see you guys later.